Greetings and welcome to the University of Minnesota Alumni Association's webinar series. My name is John Ruzek, and I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Networks here at the university. Thank you to all alumni and friends who have made time to join us live today. Over 500 of you registered because you are interested in learning about different communication styles. The Dale Carnegie Institute recently released a study revealing that over 75% of employees cite communication as the #1 opportunity for improving on-the-job engagement. In each year, U.S. businesses lose $11 billion due to employee turnover resulting from low engagement. Today's webinar speaker will look at how communication can affect the workplace and how we might correct problem areas like failing projects, consistent misunderstanding, challenging work relationships, trouble delegating, and much, much more. Today's webinar is part of a free series being offered by the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, where we're having conversations with experts about career, life, and learning topics. And this is the second to last one of the academic year. And since we've launched this series a year and a half ago, we've had over 4,000 alumni and friends tune in live with us and nearly 9,000 YouTube views of our webinar library. And initiatives like this is made possible in part by our members. So thank you so much. The webinar is being recorded and will be viewable afterwards at minnesotaalumni.org/webinars. Just give us a few business days to post it on our website. And if you're on Twitter right now, tweet at us with the hashtag UMNWebinar. We'd love to hear from you. And also, if you're on LinkedIn, you can connect in with our 31,000 person strong LinkedIn Alumni Association group. We have additional webinars coming up featuring some wide-ranging and engaging topics, and we'll be launching our series for 2016-17 beginning in July. So definitely stay tuned at minnesotaalumni.org/webinars. Just a couple of housekeeping items today before we get started about how you can best participate in today's webinar. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to listen over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane of your GoToWebinar panel and dial-in information will be displayed. If you experience audio difficulties while listening via your computer speakers, this can be caused by having multiple software applications open, which can eat up your computer's bandwidth and affect performance. So feel free to close any unnecessary applications. Also, if you're on wireless, you might want to move over to a hard Ethernet connection if you're having audio difficulties. Questions are welcome, and you may submit them at any time. Please type in your questions in the questions pane on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll monitor them along the way. So we'd love to hear from you. And it is now my pleasure to introduce today's featured speaker, Kelsey Meyer Schalkle. She is an experienced consultant and coach with over 8 years experience working for Fortune 100 companies, including Target and Ernst & Young, in various roles ranging from recruitment to leadership and development. She partners with clients seeking meaningful, lasting change and has expertise in communications, leadership development, career crafting, entrepreneurship, women in leadership, and much, much more. And we'll get her mic fired up here. Welcome, Kelsey.
Hi, thanks so much, John.
All right. Well, I'm going to give you presenter control, so everyone sit tight while we get Kelsey's presentation fired up here. All right.
Right. We good to go?
Take it away.
All right. Hey, thanks everyone so much for joining today. This is such a treat to be able to speak with you about something that I'm really passionate about. Improving communications at work and, to be honest, in life, because it's bigger than just what's happening on the job. So, John, thanks so much for the opportunity, and let's just dive in. Take a moment to think about your reason for being here today. Maybe you have a tough conversation ahead of you, or maybe you've gotten feedback that you need to work on your communication skills a little bit. Or maybe you're just a leadership junkie like me, and you will take advantage of any opportunity to learn more. Whatever your reason for being here, my goal for this session is that you have an opportunity to learn something new and take away something actionable, something that you can do differently as you walk back out into the world. So like John said, my name is Kelsey Meyer Schalkle, and I'm a graduate of CLA in Individualized Studies, or as I refer to it frequently, make up your own degree. I studied sociology, English, and retail merchandising, and it's so cool to see how that has played out in the job that I have now. So the sociology piece, this idea of understanding people and the world that they work within, ties to English, where I'm bringing in communications and interpersonal relationships that come out in so much great literature. And then retail merchandising for me is sort of the proxy for all business. So I threw it in for that reason. In undergrad, and kind of feel the same way about it now. It's sort of the foundation of the group of people that I tend to work with. I love my time at the U, and I'm so grateful for how it set me up for what I'm doing now. And the reason I'm leading off with a picture of me, a very personal picture, is because with my coaching clients, I really like to start the relationship getting to know each other on a personal and professional level. And so you've heard a bit about my professional background, but I wanted to share with you what matters to me in my personal life, because that's what I always ask for my clients. If I were honest, I'd love to sit down with each of you and have, a 30-minute coffee chat to ask you that question and know that, but with over 200 people on the line right now, that's probably not going to be a good use of our time. So I'll just jump in telling a little bit about myself. This photo is telling because it represents two things that matter a lot to me. The first is my husband. He's fantastic, and I could go on about that. And the second is travel. So he and I both love international travel, and we actually set a goal for ourselves to get abroad at least once a year. So this is a trip to Ireland at the Cliffs of Moher. Some of our other recent trips have been to Colombia and Turkey and Slovenia, to name a few. So we're totally into that. The other thing that I care the most about, and will always come out in conversations and everything else, is that I love growth and learning how to love people better. So that's going to be kind of an underlying piece of all of this, is how do we grow and become the best that we can be. And throughout the conversation today, I'm going to be asking you questions. I'd love your feedback in real time. It's so helpful for me to understand what you're thinking about, what this means to you, so that it can be more applicable. And the other thing is, just like I said at the beginning, it's so important to me that there's something tangible that you can take away from this. The odds of that happening increase greatly if you're able to really engage with it on a personal level so that it actually has meaning for you. So right now, we'll do our first attempt at this sort of two-way conversation. In this instance, I'm going to ask you to respond by typing into that question pane that John pointed out to you. So the question that I'm asking you to respond to in the question pane with your answer is, what are some specific behaviors that frustrate you the most in other people's communication? For instance, to give an example, I get annoyed. It's really frustrating for me when people give too much detail and I'm still focusing on the big picture. So when that's happening, I just get, I kind of get lost in the moment and frustrated. It might be easier for you to think of some of these sort of difficult or frustrating behaviors if you can think of someone specifically who drives you a little bit crazy. It's just helpful to grab onto something more tangible and then build out some behaviors from there. So I see a lot of great answers coming in. I see negativity, being passive aggressive, lack of specificity. So somebody's my opposite. That's cool. Someone who's rambling. Hopefully that won't be the case. Tone, not getting to the point, too impersonal, interrupting, talking down to coworkers. Guys, these are all really, really great things. Not great things in conversation, but great examples of frustrating behaviors. Awesome. So what annoys us most often, the things that really annoy us, most often spring from a conflict of styles. Of course, there are other reasons we have difficulty in conversations, especially when it's emotionally volatile stuff. But when we're thinking about day-to-day interpersonal interactions, it's a lot of times differing styles that are missing each other that cause these frustrations, and I hear that in a lot of that list. We're going to reference that list again and again as we go through this, so kind of keep in mind both the person maybe that you were thinking about and what are some of those behaviors. So our goal for today is to become more effective in your interpersonal communications, and there's two pieces to that. One is identifying your style so you can better recognize and adapt to the communication needs of others. And the second is gaining confidence in your ability to enter and hold productive, courageous conversations. More specifically, you'll learn about the 4 communication styles and attempt to identify your own. You'll recognize how you come across to others. You'll build some versatility into your style so you can adapt when it's necessary. And you'll identify when a courageous conversation may be relevant and walk away with a few tools and concepts for applying. So how are we going to do that? Here's the agenda. We're going to talk about communication styles, we'll talk about adaptability, we'll talk about courageous conversations, and there'll be time at the end for a question and answer session. So as I mentioned, that webinar is going to be really interactive. If it were up to me, this would be a webinar workshop. But please continue to be engaged. I think it's so helpful for both sides of other sides of the internet to stay engaged that way. George Bernard Shaw once said, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." So this begs the question, where does the responsibility for communication lie? Is it on the speaker or the listener, the reader or the writer? So we're going to continue to stay engaged and take an opportunity to have our first poll. So the question is, who decides when communication has taken place? Or another way to frame that is, who decides when a message has been communicated? I'll give you a few seconds to submit your answers, and then we'll have an opportunity to look at what everyone said.
We'll give it a few more seconds here to allow some people to chime in. All right, there you go.
Wow, it's so interesting. Okay, so we have, as you guys can see, 77% of people said that the listener decides when communication has taken place. And I am imagining there's a lot of people who are feeling like, oh, I wanted to select both answers and we made it so you couldn't, so sorry. But the bottom line is that both parties play a part. But in the end, the burden of communication and making sure a message gets across falls on the communicator. So this is why we're really focusing on understanding ourselves as communicators, and I want to introduce you to this concept of communication styles. When I say communication style, what do you think of? Feel free to type in an answer to the question pane, or just think this in your head. We won't spend a ton of time here, but just get an idea of how you might define communication style, or what is a style. Okay, so lock into that idea. For our purposes today, this is how we'll define style. It's how we come across to others, the patterns or habits of communication, how we feel comfortable communicating, how we process information, and how we relate to our role or setting. Additionally, it's something we use most of the time, but not all of the time. And a lot of things might influence our personal styles. We have some learned behaviors that we pick up from family and friends. We can rely on what's worked well for us in the past. And there's personality, which has a bearing, but really isn't indicative necessarily of what our style is. We have a natural style, though it can vary somewhat by the situation and our role. It shows up both verbally and non-verbally, so in the way that we speak and the way that we use our bodies. We often revert to our natural style under stress, or we can actually jump to the opposite extreme when we're really stressed. So to get a little crisper on this, one way to think about style is thinking about Sean Connery and Daniel Craig. They both played James Bond, but the ways they communicated, even with just their nonverbals, makes it clear that they both have really strong and really different styles. So we've clarified what style is a little bit, but let's put some boundaries on what it is not. So style is not personality. It's not good or bad, and it's not fixed for life. Personality is just one aspect of style, and there's an actual communications assessment that we won't be able to go through, but I'm going to have you kind of try and self-assess. It doesn't map back to any personality assessments because they are separate things. And styles aren't good or bad. What makes it feel good or bad is really when our default style is becoming ineffective and we're unable to adapt. And style isn't fixed for life. We can and often do adapt. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what these 4 styles are. If I have any consultants on the phone, this slide should get you really excited because it's a 2x2. And the 4 styles actually organize into these wonderful, predictable patterns on different axes. So the first axis we're going to look at is power or dominance. And to be clear, power, that word carries a lot of weight and a lot of meaning, but this is not about how much power I actually have in a situation. It's about how I come across in the situation. So it's again about communication behaviors. So on one end we have more receptive behaviors, and on the other hand we have more assertive behaviors. The other axis is emotion or openness. So here again, same thing. It's not about how much emotion I actually feel, but it's about how my communication comes across in behaviors that are emotion-based. So am I more expressive or am I more reserved? If you were in the room with me right now, you would know I'm very high on expressive. I keep talking with my hands even though there's no one to watch. So that's just an example. And a reminder that these are descriptions, they're not judgments. They're just ways to identify a style. So like I said, though you haven't had this opportunity to take a communications assessment, I really want to give you the chance to try and self-identify, because that will help you be able to see then where some of the gaps might be in your communication. So what we're going to do on this next slide is actually look at the different words that are listed. If you grab a piece of paper, if you have something in front of you, and actually draw out this 2x2 so that you have 4 different quadrants. And what you're going to do is read through all of the words in each quadrant and put a dash, a tally, basically, for how many words you feel like fit your personality, or fit your communication style, the ones that relate to you in each quadrant. So starting with the top left one, I would say loyal, and then decide, do I put a dash in that quadrant or not? The goal is to get an idea of what 1 or 2 quadrants feel like you have the most dashes in, most marks in, because that's going to help us start identifying what your style is. So I'm going to just give you a moment to do that. I know that this takes some time to read through everything, so we're just going to have a little bit of group silence on the phone while you work your way through this page. If you're not sure about something, it's not a life or death situation, just take a guess. And maybe one thing that might ease your mind on this too is that about half of people self-identify incorrectly. So they actually need the assessment to see where they fall, because the assessment is based on how you're perceived, which is really what the communication style is about. So I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds. For those of you who take a little bit longer, take a screenshot, find another way to get some of these answers. What we're doing on the next slide is the same process, but it's going to be slightly more negative words. And the reason we have that slide is because sometimes you've gotten tough feedback on your communication style, and some of these words might ring a bell. Or they're helpful to realize that these are some of the words that people who don't share your style may sometimes feel about how you're communicating. So with that, I'm going to lead us to the next slide. So it's the same process. If you could tally, and you can use the same quadrants you've already made because it represents the same styles, and this is cumulative. So you're cumulatively tallying for each quadrant so that you can have at least a guess of which style you might be. So take a few seconds to get through this slide, read some of the words. Part of the value of actually defining our styles is it helps us move past this evaluative language that you're seeing on this slide and towards more descriptive, non-judgmental language. So I said that I'm using a ton of hand gestures, and instead of saying, oh, that's Kelsey just rambling on again, it's an opportunity for someone on my team to say, that's Kelsey, and she's acting out her style in this very talkative, very emotive way. Okay, so I'm going to have us wrap up on this. Hopefully you've gotten through most of the words here and gotten your tallies made. Now combine those two lists if you haven't already. Which quadrant has the most words that describe you? So pick your quadrant, or maybe 2 quadrants. I'll give you some leeway here. And now what we're going to do is actually identify or name what each of these different quadrants represent. So in the top left we have facilitating style. The top right is advocating. The bottom right is controlling, and the bottom left is analyzing. And we're going to walk through a little bit more detail of each of these styles by quadrant. So facilitating. This is in that receptive expressive corner of the map. People who have a facilitating style tend to be warm and relaxed. They use emotional language, they're good conversationalists, and they're really participative group members. You can sometimes identify them because they're focused on the who of the problem. Advocating style. So these are in the expressive and assertive quadrant. They love to promote. They promote causes and ideas. They capitalize on opportunities. They use emotional and powerful language. And they're dynamic and interested in the big ideas. You can some way to identify them is that they're really focused on the why of the problem. Controlling style. They're in that assertive, reserved part of the quadrant. They tend to be structured and competitive, results-oriented, they have forceful opinions, and they're not afraid to communicate them. They're serious, they're confident, and tend to be focused on the what of the problem. Those of you who are controlling style were probably annoyed by my introduction and getting personal and spending a long time talking about that, so that can be a flag for you. And analyzing style. So this is in the reserved and receptive quadrant. They're patient and thorough. They prefer facts over intuition and tend to be very process-oriented. They tend to be measured and not exaggerating and really focus on the how of the problem, which, as you can imagine, goes into all sorts of detail. So some things to keep in mind as we're thinking about these 4 styles mapped out. We all exhibit some of these characteristics sometimes, but we generally favor one style with a backup. And we like our own style. We feel good about that style. We wish other people were that style. And that's okay. It's just style isn't good or bad. It's just used well or not so well, which is combined with this ability to adapt that we're going to talk about. So let's take a quick poll. With which style do you most identify? So I see John has the poll up there, so you can take an opportunity to select which of the 4 that you think feels the most accurate for you. Great, that's a great breakout. Okay, so we see we have a lot of facilitating style on the phone, or people who identify that way, and followed by analyzing, advocating, and then controlling. And I hope you don't feel bad if you're controlling, because I think it's a pretty great style. They all have their good and bad. But that's great. So now we just have a sense of who's on the phone. And you're taking at least a stab at where you think you are. So style is half the equation. To use what we're learning about our own styles and others' styles, we need to be able to adapt, which starts with recognizing that our own style is not the style of everyone else. And that can actually really inhibit our effective conversations. Adaptability is the willingness to and the ability to meet the communication needs of others. So here's how it's achieved. It's achieved through the process of temporarily subordinating our preferences regarding sending and receiving messages. The words to really focus on in that statement are temporarily and preferences. So let me say it again. The process of temporarily, so not always or forever, subordinating our preferences, which means your behaviors, not your personality or identity. You don't need to become a different person to adapt your style. So here's a question I want you to just ponder at your desk or wherever you might be right now. How are you affected when your communication needs are not met? What are the consequences to your job performance? The same things happen to other people when we don't meet their communication needs. And the thing is, meeting the communication needs of others actually helps us achieve our own goals. So the good news is we can learn to adapt our style to meet others' preferences. I've had people say, well, shouldn't other people adapt to me? Which, of course, they should. That would be great. But the thing is, how important is it to you to get what you need in any given interaction? You only have control over you. And what I often see is if that you move towards others first, they often reciprocate by moving towards you and your style as well. The other thing to keep in mind is you don't have to jump to the opposite style. I'm pretty high up in that advocating corner. I'm like up in the right-hand corner. You know, I'm not going to be able to move all the way down to the analyzing corner and connect on that level. But I can do my best to move toward it, and that makes all the difference. Adaptability has 2 components, and these bear out in the assessment that I've talked about as well. It's accessibility and negotiability. Accessibility is about how reachable you are, and negotiability is your perceived willingness to consider change. So a little bit more on accessibility. There are 3 parts to this: physical, intellectual, and emotional. So physical is around when a response is wanted or needed, are you there to give it? So do you give people enough face time? How quickly do you answer your email or voice messages? Intellectual is about information sharing. Do you overshare or undershare? Do you talk up or talk down to people? Which, by the way, that was one of the things that I saw a lot of at the beginning, annoying listening behaviors, is people being talked down to, or annoying communication behaviors. And then emotional. So do you recognize the other person and recognize their feelings in the situation? Are you showing empathy, and if not, what contributes to your lack of empathy? Or do you overshare? Negotiability is about, are you willing to listen and discuss before deciding, and are you willing to change your mind? The thing to note here is that negotiability is really about the perception more than the reality in a lot of cases. You may be totally open to new ideas, but because of how you come across, say you're a strong advocating or controlling style, people may not feel that you are, and so then they won't share. And that affects your negotiability. So we're going to take another quick poll here. Which facet of adaptability do you think is the most challenging for you? Accessibility or negotiability? Yeah, that's really interesting. So I see 70% of people are saying negotiability and 30% accessibility. And I think that's interesting given the society that we live in. I know a lot of people on the call are in the US, and that's a big thing, is showing up and being strong and communicating in that sort of way. So it could make sense that that goes against some of that negotiability. And having a point of view, I know that's big in consulting. Interesting. Okay, so we're going to start bringing this all together. So think back to the person that you felt you have the most difficult conversations with, where it's just, you get frustrated by their communication habits. Might they be in a quadrant that's opposite of the one that you've self-identified? Regardless of where they are, try and figure out where you think they might fit on this map. So here's some things to think about. Does the person speak in short, clipped ways and send like one-word emails? He or she might be controlling. Or does the person seem to avoid confrontation but is really comfortable engaging in friendly conversations? Maybe facilitating. Is he or she always talking about that next great idea, but you've yet to see anything implemented? That might be advocating. And does this person always get into the details, wanting to know how it's going to get done, who is doing it, when? That might be analyzing. So what I have here on this slide are ways for you to start thinking differently about the people that you struggle communicating with. So each area, each style has our likes and dislikes. And if you can really hone in on both what your style is and the style of the person with whom you're trying to communicate, there's ways to bridge that gap. So for me, I've self-identified and assessed it as advocating. So when I'm trying to speak to someone who's more in the facilitating side of things, it's really important for me to make sure, even though I might like entertaining and contributing ideas and things that are big and bold, the facilitating style may feel that that's like high pressure or confrontational, and that's not as comfortable. So how do I bridge that gap and think about making it more informal, finding ways for them to participate and share opinions? So I'm going to challenge you. This is the coach in me. I can't get away from it. Grab that piece of paper that's in front of you and jot a couple notes. What are one or two things that, man, I could try this new approach with someone and see if we get a little bit closer style-wise. So lastly, there are certain times when adapting is especially important. The first is when you're stuck. Another one is when it's not going well. And a third time is around initial introductions. I'll give you a little pointer on initial introductions. It's really helpful to keep in mind that the three styles outside of controlling can be pretty open to different styles at the get-go. So always assume that the person is controlling, and you'll be setting yourself up for more success going forward. And then you can adapt as you learn more. And the last is around delivering difficult messages, which is a perfect segue into the last part that we're talking about, which is courageous conversations. So courageous conversations which are also known as difficult conversations or tough conversations or challenging conversations, or that conversation I know I should be having, but I'm putting it off for whatever reason that I've decided is good enough. So really, what are courageous conversations? A courageous conversation has three components: opposing opinions, strong emotions, and high stakes. And we call them courageous because they take courage to have them. They're the kinds of conversations we don't look forward to. So what's an example of what this looks like? One thing that comes to mind for me is one of the clients that I've been coaching was just promoted to an SVP level. She moved from being with peers to now managing her peers. And not only that, but was tasked with firing or letting go of one of them. Really tough situation. We spent an hour on the phone mapping out how she wanted to show up in that conversation so she felt she could go into it in a really authentic, helpful, productive way. Can you think of other types of courageous conversations? So feel free to throw some examples in the question pane if you can think of some courageous conversations that come to mind. Like, what are other examples? I'll list a few that I thought of, but I love seeing what else other people think of. So I have giving a boss negative feedback, or approaching a boss who's behaving unethically, talking to an employee who isn't keeping commitments, or giving an unfavorable performance review, negotiating a salary or a job offer. They can be personal too, so I'll throw this out there. Yeah, I just saw one, discussing college choices with my daughter. They can be personal too, so that's a great example. It could be asking a friend to repay a loan, or ending a relationship, sharing some unmet needs with your partner, reconnecting with a family member. I just saw that example. It's great. Talking with your kids about tough dynamics. All really, really great examples. Here's the thing. How do we typically handle courageous or difficult conversations? Because we have three options. The first is this: we can avoid them. The second is we can face them but handle them poorly. And the third is we can face them and handle them well. So I'm going to ask you to take one more poll, which is, how, if we're honest with ourselves, how do you typically handle courageous conversations? And this is assuming, I know that no one handles them all. We've all had probably the three. Hopefully you've all handled one well. But, I mean, Okay. Yeah. So we have a lot in the avoiding camp, which totally makes sense. A handful that feel like they handle them poorly, and a handful that feel like they handle them well. There are plenty of times when any one of us avoids these conversations because they're uncomfortable, or we're uncomfortable with the confrontation, or we don't know how to do it well, or a bit of both. And a lot of times we set ourselves up with basically a false choice. So at its most extreme, we basically believe we either have to tell the truth or try and somehow maintain a relationship, and that these two are going to always be incompatible. But the impact, so it makes sense that we want to run away, but the impact of not having these courageous conversations is also felt. And I'm sure you can remember a situation where this has happened. More often than not, the problem doesn't go away. Sometimes it even gets worse. And then, as we know, that just makes the conversation more difficult to face. So how do we begin to actually face these tough conversations in an effective way? I've read a lot about it. I've read the research, and I also am so passionate about this topic. It's part of why I had to include this into the communication styles, because I think there's so much that we can do to do this better and well and get great results. So what I would say the three main components are contemplative preparation, staying aware in the moment, and fostering dialogue. We're going to talk through each of these three, and I'll bring in a real-life example from my experience, but I want you to know there's a bit of this that's going to feel like an information download because there's so much great information here. I'll do my best to give you that and then keep us moving. But like I said, the reason we're going into this is because I believe that people can do these well, and that if we don't avoid them, it works out better. I know it's crazy. If there are people in this room, I think you'd be having some shocked faces, but that's that. Okay, so the first part, contemplative preparation. First things first is work on yourself first, because that's who you can control. The second is identify and focus on what you really want. So as the conversation unfolds, it's really easy to get swept up in defending something that's not the most important thing. We can lose sight of what our goal is and start making the in-the-moment goal something around saving face or avoiding embarrassment or wanting to win, or to be right, or maybe to punish others. And it's those moments that you need to have a really clear, what do I really want goal to come back to. The last one is search for the and option. So it's frequent that we get tripped up thinking it has to be this or this. So, and the example I'm going to talk about is let my boss continue to talk down to me and others in meetings, or risk making my boss even angrier. There's almost always a way to do both things that we want. It's to address the behavior while maintaining a positive relationship. So the example that I have, it was really early in my career. It was about a year into my job, and I had a boss. Well, actually, it was my boss's boss's boss, but she led the team for everyone. And I had not been performing as well as I should have been. And there was another person on the team who had been underperforming for a lot longer. And the team meetings, we had weekly team meetings that were getting toxic. The boss would say things like, why didn't you do this? Or, basically asking very fair questions, but the tone in which they were conveyed and the body language behind it created that toxic, scary environment where the whole rest of the team was impacted. And so I had a courageous conversation with her with the goal, what I really wanted was to help her understand the impact that was having on the rest of the team. The starting with myself first was recognizing and owning which parts were on me. So yes, I haven't been performing to your expectations. Focusing on what I really want was, like I said, and the third part was taking the risk to say, if I can do this in a non-defensive way and help her from remaining defensive, maybe we can get some more productive. So I'll talk more about that. The second piece is about staying aware in the moment. So recognizing that conditions trump content is huge. What this means is that people's reactiveness or defensiveness levels, the emotional safety of the environment, is more important than what is being said. Until we're good at paying attention to that, we're going to struggle with difficult conversations. The next is staying aware of your own reactions. And if you feel yourself getting defensive or attacking, here are 3 questions to ask yourself in this order. The first is, what emotions are encouraging me to act this way? The second is, what story is creating these emotions? And the third is, what evidence do I have to support this story? Finally, it's focusing on what I own. What am I ignoring about my role in this problem? Because we all do that. We want to see ourselves as innocent because it's just so much easier to live with ourselves that way. But that is what damages the safety of the room and the credibility of the conversation. So that's where I come back to this point of owning I'm not performing, but that doesn't negate the fact that the way that these conversations are being had is not getting to my boss's real goal, which is to see the whole team perform better. So lastly, if you're able to do these 2 pieces, so set up well and be prepared in the moment, or be aware in the moment, there's sort of a flow to these sorts of conversations that you'll see typically. The first is sharing your observations, not your conclusions, but your observations. So it might be, I noticed I'm feeling anxious, or I noticed you were late for this meeting, or I noticed, even though the content, the words that you said would be fine in a transcript, actually the tone behind them created an entirely different environment and message. The second is to share what you're beginning to conclude. So I'm starting to think that this means ... Next, it's own that it's your story. So this is the part where you say, this is what I'm seeing, and this is what I think it might mean. But I want to hear what you have to say about it, which is asking input from others. And in this piece, it's really important to acknowledge the other person's emotions. So in the instance that I'm talking about, I shared what I shared. I shared my observations and what I was beginning to conclude, owned the story, and then I said, after I asked for her input, I said, that makes sense that you'd be frustrated. That totally makes sense, because you want this team to perform well. And so it's connecting with that other person's emotional state and restating what you heard. So I hear you are trying to get the whole team to perform better. And guess what? We can get aligned on that goal. The last thing is making decisions. So that means who's doing what, by when, and with what follow-up. So in the case that I shared, that opened up a whole new door of relationship with this leader. she actually asked me to be a trusted advisor, and we started meeting on a biweekly basis to check in on her feedback, the feedback that I had for her at each of our team meetings, so that she could continue to grow and get out of her team what she really wanted. So we've covered a lot of ground. I hope you walk away with a few new ideas. And I want to just ask one final check-in question. So this is one that you can type into that question pane. What are your biggest takeaways from the conversation? Or what is one thing that you'll do differently? So I'll give you a moment to think about this. You know I'm going to ask you to write it on the notebook that's in front of you, so you should just go ahead and do that as well. But take a moment to think about what might you do differently, or what takeaway do you have from this? Yeah, so I'll share some of what I'm hearing. Be aware of styles. Assume positive intent. Oh, there's a lot coming in quickly. That's great. Take a moment to assess what communication style someone else may be. Pay attention to how my communication style directly affects others. Always assume controlling at the beginning, then adapt. Yep. Great. That's great. Courageous conversations start with contemplative preparation. Be mindful of my communication style. That's great. Gosh, thank you so much. I mean, the hope and point of this is that there's something that you gain that's going to make you even better going forward. So the last piece I wanted to give you was some of the resources that I think are really valuable in this big space of communications. The first is the assessment I talked about. It's really cool because it allows you to map yourself versus your team as well, and so you can kind of start understanding how people work together in a communication sense. The second is a lot of books around how to have some of these tough conversations that can be such a great starting point. So Crucial Conversations I referenced a lot, but each of these other books are really great as well. And then if you have more questions or want to continue the conversation, I love connecting with people, so please feel free to reach me at kelsey@leadershiplaunch.co, not .com, .co. Thank you so much for the time, for the great questions, the great feedback and input. Now I am so open to taking some questions for a question and answer session.
All right. Well, let's. If you do have questions for Kelsey, feel free to type it into the questions pane. We've had a lot of great feedback, so we'll try to sort through all the great comments and topics that people are saying. So, what is the name of the assessment that your presentation is based on?
Yeah, it's called the Perceptive Communications Assessment.
Okay. What do you do when the other person is not open to having a courageous conversation?
Yeah, so that can look like a lot of different things. The first thing I would say is test that assumption. So we may assume that the person's not open to it, but until you've had a strategic thought around how to get to that conversation, that may or may not be true. So that I would actually start there with the assumption. But yes, there are times when someone is just going to shut down and not be willing to hear or talk. And there are other ways then that you have to set up personal life boundaries to figure out how you're going to navigate around that.
Mm-hmm. How do you recommend handling a speaker that will not stop talking?
I hope you weren't thinking about me in that question.
Well, that's your role for the webinar. You get to do all the talking. So.
Yeah, like if I was a better winker and you could see me. But anyway, how do you handle a speaker who won't stop talking? Yeah, that can be really tough. So there are a couple different ways, some more effective than others. One approach that I use is, you know what, you're saying a lot and I want to make sure I'm tracking with you. Is this what you're saying? And it's an opportunity to jump in and restate what you think you're hearing. Because honestly, that happens sometimes where there's so much being said that you may not even know where they're going. And I will add that that's a coaching technique. So sometimes as a coach, I intentionally interrupt because when we're getting into so much detail, it actually isn't valuable. It's getting to the underlying so what. And so helping them get there can actually be helpful.
All right, there are some other questions here. How do you, as an advocator, make sure to get things done?
I love that question. Yeah, so there's a couple different strategies that I take. One is making sure that I have partners who are not the same style as me and reviewing communications with different partners. So for instance, even with this webinar, I made sure that I reviewed it with people who were in different style categories than me and got their input on what would be helpful. So make sure there's examples, etc., for the analyzers. I think the question around how to get things done feels a little bit more tied to personality than just communication. And I know I kind of made those connections, but in a way that's a separate piece. What I would say, though, gosh, I just wish I could like pull off and have a whole coaching side conversation and dive into what was meant behind this question. But what I would say, though, is thinking about the advocating style and how to get things done is making sure that you are, especially when the rest of your audience is different, you're hitting some of the things that they need. So if you are talking to analyzing styles, which is in the opposite corner, that you're coming with a really well thought out plan, even if it's not something that's natural for you to want to create and put on paper and share.
Mm-hmm. And, if you want, why don't you just go back one slide, and if people do want to get in touch with you, it'll list your email, your preferred email address. How does one of our listeners writes in, how does sarcasm fit into the 4 quadrants of different communication styles? So if you're communicating with someone who's always communicating with sarcasm.
That is such a fun question. I don't know exactly. I mean, I'll because I'm advocating, I'm just going to riff on it because that's just how I roll. But, I don't know that it has a natural fit. I think you're probably more likely to see it in some of the punchier styles. So when you go more towards power, which might be advocating or controlling, or maybe when you get a little bit more emotive, so facilitating and, again, advocating. But that doesn't mean that, there's one style in particular. I would say if someone's always communicating with sarcasm, that might be off the page from the style side of things.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps in the same vein, somebody writes in, if you have someone with a very dominant or controlling communication style in a meeting who has to approve or object to each person's opinion in the meeting, and you have a very different style, such as facilitating, what would be the best way to be effective in that meeting? As far as I'm thinking, the person's writing from, they're coming from the facilitating standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think I would be really strategic before heading into that meeting and think about what is the point? What am I getting to? Almost put that lens on of what are they going to push towards and start there. But part of what you can start with is setting the expectation that we are going to take X number of minutes in this meeting to collect other people's opinions or to make sure that everyone's voices are heard, whatever it is that you feel like also needs to happen to make it the most successful. So if you lead with what you're going to do, again, they're thinking about the what. So here's what we're accomplishing. Here's how we're going to accomplish it. Go. I think that can help if you start with that and create the expectation for how you're following into it.
Mm-hmm. Any insights into how to communicate well or identify different approaches when you're conversing with people from other countries or cultures?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah. So I would say that there's a lot that goes back to listening. I mean, that's kind of an underlying theme of what can you understand from the other person. So whether you're identifying their styles and whether it's an individual personal style or maybe there's more cultural components, how do you really pay attention to what's working for them and what's not? The other thing I would say, and again, this comes from more of being a coach, is questions are so fantastic. So finding ways to ask non-invasive and non-threatening questions will open up a lot of conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that might be good advice. Somebody asked a similar question in the vein of, let's say, you're in the Midwest, grew up in Minnesota. How do you how do you deal with, maybe in the stereotypical example, maybe folks from the East Coast who are a little bit more assertive than generally maybe people in Minnesota are, and how do you work through those things? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was one I observed early into my time at Target headquarters. Is just so dramatically different, the styles. And right, there's good to both. So I would say it depends on the context that you're in and what's the overarching style. So really, for East Coasters coming to Target, there was an expectation that they adapted to the Midwest style, or they became, frankly, less effective, for good or bad. But on the opposite end, so this listener sounds like the question is more, I'm maybe in a culture that is a bit more, because cultures can be a different style too, that maybe is a bit more in the controlling style, or maybe advocating style. I would suggest it's the same thing. So think about it like that. Like, how could I identify whatever culture I'm in? If I had to categorize it or group it, what would I identify it as? And then how do I start moving in that direction in ways that are still authentic to who I am? So sure, it's pushing outside of the boundary a little bit. But again, you're not going to jump to the other side and all of a sudden be something different. So how do you make those small tweaks?
Mm-hmm. Another listener writes in, what can I do if I have the analyzing communication style and the other person has the controlling communication style?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so another thing to think about is when you're talking to a communication style that fits on the same axis, that's at least bordering you, right? So they're not all the way across kitty corner, which gives away my Minnesotan being a kitty corner. But anyways, if they border you, you can kind of align on what are some of the things that you have in common. So analyzing and controlling styles are both pretty non-emotive. So use that to your advantage. How do you stay really matter-of-fact? The biggest difference between analyzing and controlling, so what I'd say to the analyzing style is cut it down, cut it down, cut it down. What is the main point, and hit the main point. And then if the controlling person has questions, they'll ask, but don't send a barrage of information. Let them ask the questions that they have.
Mm-hmm. You got a nice comment here. One person writes in that all politicians should take your class to communicate more effectively. Here's one from one of our participants today. How do you stop an employee from, I think the story is that, like, if they're already telling, like, bringing up a story or something that they've already told you in the past, how do you circumvent that?
So what I think is fun about that's a totally fair question, but it goes back to trying to control someone else's behavior. So you kind of get to decide how you want to show up in that situation. If it's really annoying and it's making you show up in a way you don't want to show up, then I'd say, okay, come up with a few other ideas. So one might be, gosh, so cool that you're sharing that story. I think you already told me about it. Is this what you're talking about? Oh, yeah, blah, blah, blah. That could be one potential way to do it. At the same time, we can't control everything. There's going to be some communication situations where you kind of have to make it work.
Mm-hmm. One person writes that her work team is mostly introverted and analyzing as far as their communication styles. She is a visionary, not liking processes, kind of the advocating aspect. She's been told that she doesn't communicate well with her colleagues. So what would be your recommendation on how this person could improve?
Oh, I hear you. First of all, I get that. But what I would say is, so watch what they do. Again, it's a great place to start, is watch how do they communicate. So what language are they using? How do they present? What visually are they sharing? What can you learn from that? And keep in mind, so I'll go back a few slides because I think that this is, we kind of have had a lot of questions around this. So here. So think about how are you going to make sure that the audience is really informed, and not informed about ideas and big concepts, but how do you inform them on the details, even if that's not what you're energized by? How do you really clearly give the logic and reason and do your best to hold back some of the emotion that comes out? Words like exciting, dead giveaway to someone who's advocating. I'm so excited, or this will be so fun. John, you've already heard me say that a few times today. But so it's how do you pull back some of that language and focus more and more on matter of fact. So here's the data. Here's what we think it means, etc.
Mm-hmm. We'll just do a couple quick more questions here. Is there any correlation between age group, so like boomers, Gen X, millennials, and communication style? In your opinion?
Yeah, it's a great question. To my knowledge, so what I know from this assessment, there's not. But I imagine that people listening could say, well, I really think millennials are whatever, or I could see Gen X being this way. But I think overall, there's enough individuals within any group group of people that maybe different age groups tend towards a certain bucket, but that doesn't mean that they're typically a certain category.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have any quick recommendations for executives and how they should communicate when going through turbulent times in a workplace such as layoffs?
Oh man, I'm working with a client right now that is in that same situation, and we do a lot of, so this is, I'll try and get to the communication piece specifically, but we do a lot around change management in general. And I work with a fantastic company called Good Leadership that has this approach called the head, the heart, and the hands. And so each of those pieces are really fundamental to how you communicate, and a lot of times different parts of that get missed. So the head is helping explain the why, what's the bigger why, what is this driving us towards, and not missing out on that. People need that. The heart is recognizing there are emotions involved and being okay with that and connecting to those emotions. And the hands is the part that gets the most often missed, which is what can you give them to do now? So there's all this change, things are disrupted, but people won't feel better until they can start having a stake in it again. So give them something to do. That's my quick spiel.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, what if there are conflicts between people who have the same communication style?
Yes, this happens a lot, actually. Thank you for that great question. That's really common. Because, so, you know, if you have two controlling or two advocating, sometimes it's great and you're comfortable and it's working for you, but sometimes you want to take over or, you know, analyze it. Well, I'm going to analyze it a different way. So it's just, again, it's something to be aware of, and then kind of give yourself, kind of check your mirrors to say, okay, so what do I need to do a little bit differently? So something's irking me. They're probably my same style. How do I give them space to be their style without overpowering it?
All right. Well, Kelsey, thank you so much for your time today. I know just from reading through the questions that a lot of people thought that this was really fantastic, and I absolutely agree with them. So I thank you so much for sharing your time and talent with us today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. All right, everybody, that's a wrap. Actually, one thing, if you've been online and not paying attention to the news, there's been some sad news being reported through various media outlets. For those of you with a Minnesota connection, the rock and musical artist Prince passed away at age 57. That broke here over the noon hour. So multiple media reports saying that Prince has passed away. So thoughts and condolences to him and his family. So meant a lot to Minnesota. So just wanted to let people know that if you hadn't been online. But in closing, just want to thank everyone who joined us today and members of the University of Minnesota Alumni Association who make initiatives like this webinar series possible. Thank you. Because of members, we can enrich the lives of alumni, support student success, and make a better University of Minnesota. So if you're interested in becoming a member, join us at minnesotalumni.org/join. And that's the conclusion of today's webinar. Thanks again for joining us and being an active member of our worldwide community of 455,000 alumni and friends. Have a great day.